welcome back to my channel, and welcome if you are new here. I'm Andrea.M, and last Saturday my incredible Clarence Valley Paranormal team and I went on another adventure, and this time we were in search of the abandoned Australian Meatworks company, and they were located around 40 kilometres west from Grafton at Ramornie. We had local info that the general consensus was the area was quite haunted, so we ventured out to Ramornie, which, let me just say, has some stunning scenery and is a beautiful location. And I was expecting that some of the structures would still be standing, but what we found instead was actually some pretty stunning ruins, and you will see them in the main investigation video. In this video, I just wanted to give you the history of Charles Tyndall, the proprietor of the Meatworks company, and what a major operation that it was occurring just outside Grafton at Ramornie, and that was from the late 1800s to the early 1900s. And it took a lot of ingenuity for such a massive undertaking so early in our history. I'll also just say that if you are vegetarian or vegan, this won't be the video for you. Obviously, it's the Meatworks and some pretty awful things happened to the animals at the Meatworks. And you have to remember it was like early 1800s, so the way they did things back then would be different to today. And in the article I read, and I will be reading to you for the history, it does become a little bit graphic about what they did to the animals in the process of making the products, but I'm going to try and cut as much of that part out as possible because I don't like it myself and I don't think it will be enjoyable for most viewers. But if you are vegan or vegetarian and you're sensitive to this kind of thing, it's okay if you don't want to watch this part of the video, but you can watch our main investigation video because we don't sort of go into any of that. We're just looking at the place and seeing if we could pick up on anything. So that part of the video I think would be fine for you. So what we actually found when we got up there was that not much of it was left standing, but we did get some pretty stunning photography, with a big thank you to Bianca and to Kevin and Jess and to our newest member of the team, Chantal, who took some really stunning photos. And this photo was one of my favourites we got that day. Chantal actually layered a few on top of each other to get what was going on in this photo. And if you look closely, this is one of the trees that is actually growing out of the middle of what used to be the main production floor of the Meatworks. And on first glance, it doesn't look like anything special, but when you zoom in, you can actually see a face in the trees, and there's like an aura coming off the trees. And where this tree was is actually where Bianca said that she had a feeling there was a portal for the spirits to come in and out of. And as it's winter time in Australia at the moment, the veil is very thin if you believe in that kind of thing. So the spirits are quite prolific at the moment, and that's why I really love to do investigations during the winter time out here. Also, it's usually the only time of year that we can actually get out during the day, because we do like to film during the day. A lot of you have said that you enjoy our daytime filming because you get to see the scenery. So that's why we're kind of sticking to daytime filming, also for the safety factor. But during winter's the only time we can really get out during the day because it's just way too hot during summer. And I have issues. I don't do well in the heat. Bianca doesn't do well in the heat. Most of us don't. So that's why we like to film so much in winter. So we got this really stunning photo of this tree. There were other photos as well that were a little otherworldly, which I'll just pop in here for you to see. But you'll see all this in the main video anyway. And I also have to give a huge shout out to Kevin and Jess for finding the articles, and to Chantal for helping find the articles that I could read for this doco. I actually had trouble finding the histories myself. They seemed to be able to pull them up and share them to me so that I could make the doco for the before video. Now, you don't have to watch this to watch our paranormal investigation, but it does give a very interesting overview of the history of Ramornie. And when you actually see what little is left of this place, and you hear about the history, it was actually a bustling hub, and it employed about 150 men that were working at the Meatworks. So there was like a little city that was up there. There was this huge factory, And the Tyndalls actually lived a little further up the road at Ramornie Station. So it was quite the bustling community, similar to our video at Dalmorton with the mining. This was a huge factory that employed very many people, and it also gave work to the steamboat operators coming up and down the Clarence, who would come in and bring in the materials to make the cans. It was actually a preserved meat company. So they would bring in materials to make the cans to put the meat in, and then they would ship the meat back out, and they would come in up a tributary of the Clarence into the Orara, which is the river that flows up the top there at Ramornie, and the boats would come in there and they would pick up the product and then they would take them away for sale. But I'll get into all of that when I get into the history of the place. So, yeah, I reckon we'll just jump into the history of everything. And I can't remember if I said it before, but I'll say it again. Please don't forget to like, share, and subscribe if you haven't already. Your subscriptions, your likes, your shares, and your comments do help me with the YouTube algorithm and get my videos recommended to more people, which means more subscribers for me, which means when I hit my 1,000 and I can be invited to join the partnership program, I will actually be getting some of my videos monetized, which means an income for me, which means I can buy better equipment and take our team to places further afield, which will mean a lot better videos for you guys. So if you'd like to help me out with that, I would sure appreciate it. And let's just get on into the history of the Ramornie Meatworks. So we got this information from a very early newspaper story published in the Sydney Morning Herald, found on the amazing newspaper history website Trove, and I will put you a link in the description box below if you'd like to go to Trove and find out a little bit about things that happened in early Australia. So Charles Tyndall came to Australia in 1843 at the age of 20. By 1852, he was settled on his own properties and had a small boiling down plant at Ramornie on the Clarence River near Grafton. And that was what became the Meatworks. Ramornie was a cattle run, and as early as 1849, Tyndall had been showing an interest in meat preservation. He favoured salting, but the Crimean War that was going on at the time pushed up the value of tallow, and boiling down continued to be more profitable. So what they mean by tallow, it's a fatty rendering byproduct that comes off the like red meat when you boil it all up, and they used to use it for all sorts of things. They'd make candles, they'd use it for lamp oil, all that kind of thing. So it was quite a profitable product, as well as the meat products that he was manufacturing at the time. In 1862, Tyndall took his family to England and saw for himself the results of the rinderpest plague on English herds. And the rinderpest plague was an infectious disease of cattle and other herd animals, and it resulted in high mortality rates. So the demand for meat increased rapidly, and Tyndall started to study canning. In 1865, he formed the Australian Meat Company, of which he was the major shareholder and the general manager. Its address was 137 Houndsditch in London. A factory was built for him on the Orara River in New South Wales, near its junction with the Clarence, and production began in the latter half of 1866. And this was the location that we were at, was his actual meatworks at Ramornie. So the raw material came from the herds of the region, and at first from Tyndall's own cattle at Ramornie, and the major products were canned meats and Liebig's meat extract. But the byproducts, as we said before, such as the tallow, hides and bones were also exported. They used to use the entire animal, which, if you have to go through a sad process of slaughtering animals to get food and stuff, and you're actually using the entire animal, kind of, well, for me, it kind of sits a little bit better that I don't eat red meat at all. At least the entire animal was being put to use after its death. So that kind of softens the blow just a teensy-weensy bit. By 1871, Ramornie was employing 150 men, from slaughterers through to plant from slaughterers through to plant operatives and tinsmiths to packers. The workforce and raw materials were stable, but Tyndall's biggest problem was the duty levied by the colonial government on the tin plate and the solder constituents, an impost for which he got no relief when the same materials were re-exported as cans around his products. Tyndall was not himself the technologist. In 1866, he sent out Alban G. and Thomas Cordingley to staff the works, and the technology was employed. And it was called Goldner's. And I'm not sure what Goldner's is. I had trouble finding that, but I would say it was a new technology that was a little more economical in like the making of the cans. And how they used to actually like preserve the meat and boil it is it would be packed into the cans and it would be boiled in these big boiler vats. And there were actually a couple of those still present at Ramornie. I'm not sure if we got them on film. They might be there in a picture, but they were just like these two big metal drums or baths or something you might say. So that was probably where they put the cans in, or it was either where they put the cans in to boil them or where they were boiling up all the meat products. So at first there was a man named John McCall and company of 137 Houndstitch, and they were the London agents. But later the Australian Meat Company, as we said before, established its own offices in London. And its canned meats first reached the London market early in 1867, and aided by the shortage of meat resulting from the cattle plague, it sold very well. Ramornie produced quite large amounts of canned meat and Leeberg's meat extract and continued in production until 1915, when it was sold to the Kensington Meat Preserving Company. It worked for only a season or two after the First World War and then was demolished. Through Ramornie and the men he brought to Australia, Tyndall made a significant contribution to the Australian canned meat industry. He died in England in 1914, aged 90. And it was around this same time as we just said, the meatworks were closed for good around a year after his death and basically demolished. But there was, as we said, a little bit still left there when we arrived on Saturday. So the following details of works involved in the industry, I'll try to keep the worst graphic bits out of it, but viewer discretion is advised if you're sensitive to this. And this was actually this is the article that I got from Trove, and it's by a Sydney Morning Herald reporter. His name isn't actually on the document. It doesn't actually say who the reporter was. I don't know why they didn't put their names on their stories back then, but apparently they didn't. So I'm just going to read a little bit of his actual visit. He came from Sydney and he actually visited the meatworks up there at Ramornie. And what I find interesting is at one point he says, like, as you can imagine, this is a meat processing plant. It's also where they slaughtered the cattle. And he's talking about the odor. Like, you can imagine it would smell quite bad up there. And even as I was sitting there the other day, I was picking up on like a hint of a rancid kind of a meat smell. It wasn't too bad, but something was definitely trying to show me what had been there before. So I found that really interesting when he speaks about how bad the place smelt. So I'm going to read the article. I hope you guys find it interesting, and I'll try and gloss over the bits that might be a bit yuck for most of us who don't eat red meat. I don't eat red meat, so let's go. The works of the Australian Meat Company by Sydney Morning Herald reporter. So the works of the Australian Meat Company are situated on the Orara River, a tributary of the Clarence, and are about 10 miles or 40 kilometres distant from Grafton. The river is navigable for some miles above the company's establishment, and a small steamer or droga makes regular weekly trips to the place, taking up supplies of coal and bringing back to Grafton cargoes of preserved meat packed in cases and ready for shipment to the colonial and foreign markets. The works, which stand upon the northern bank of the river, are not very prepossessing in their appearance, and the odour which fills the surrounding atmosphere is not at all calculated to sharpen the appetite or give one a relish for preserved meat. And I had to have a chuckle when I read that, because I was picking up on that. It was like that rancid meat slaughter yard kind of an odour that would have been present back in the day. That was coming through very strongly for me, and I found that really interesting. He goes on to write, a low range of beds and slaughter yards, a multitude of boxes, tins, boards and scraps of old iron, a mammoth heap of bones and refuse meat, and certain unsavoury gutters of filth are the objects which are first seen from the opposite side of the river. And I can imagine what that would be like for a reporter, and he was probably quite young too, to be coming down to report on this place. And that's the first thing you see and smell. I think that would have been quite confronting for him. But I mean, good on this guy. He's come to do his job and he did it. But yeah, I'm one of these people who's bad with smells too. So if that had been like a real smell still, I think I would have handled it as well as this reporter did. So props to whoever he was back in the day. He was definitely a courageous person. Even at that distance, the river is about 100 feet wide and the banks slope off to about double that distance. The perfume is much too strong to be pleasant. The establishment is very extensive and keeps a very large number of men employed. When in full work, about 80 head of cattle are slaughtered there per day. And with what butchers, tinsmiths, engineers, carpenters, meat curers, and there are between 70 and 80 workmen kept constantly engaged. So, wow, 80 cattle slaughtered a day. I mean, that just goes to show you what a thriving business it was, but it's also kind of sad. I mean, the poor cows and things, it's kind of sad, but I guess people had to eat, and things were a lot different back in those days. The slaughter yards and the butcher's shed occupy the central portion of the works. Between them and the river are the engines, the baths for boiling the meat, the carpenter's shops where the cases in which the meat are exported are made, the painting rooms and the stores. At the end of the butcher's shed are the vats used in making the beef extract. So now I'm getting a bit more of a picture of what we were actually looking at, because there was like a lintel that went across and like a little door, and there were like, you'll see on the video anyway, but they were like these little structures, and then the vats were sort of there. So that must have been what that was, as I thought, where they were boiling up the meat at the butcher's shed. So the branchings off from this place are the workshops of the tinsmiths, who are constantly engaged in making the tins for the boiled beef and the beef extract. These workshops are fitted with great completeness, machinery being applied to almost everything. There are machines for cutting the tin into proper sizes, machines which roll the cut strips into the required cylindrical shapes, machines which cut out the tops and bottoms, and machines that will mark the rims, stamp the lid and punch a small hole in each, the use of which will be explained presently. There seems to be a good deal of material wasted in this workshop. Strips of tin are lying about in all directions, and outside there are piles of them big enough to freight a small vessel. If these strips were near an English town, there is no doubt they would be utilised in some way, even though they might serve only as a material for a toy maker. The cases in which the tins of meat extract are packed are made of white pine, which grows plentiful in the district. So it sounds like, because you have to think back then, they wouldn't have the access to pre-made things for their business like we have now. So they were utilising everything that was in the local area, which is cool in a way because they were using what they had, but also it kind of decimates some of the species of trees and things around the area. But we can't get too mad because they didn't understand that kind of thing back then. They were just doing a job using what they had. So while it is sad to think that a lot of the trees were probably just used and are gone now, they didn't know any better, so can't get too mad. So several carpenters are kept at work in this portion of the premises. So the cattle that were to be slaughtered were put into the yards at the end of the butchering shed, and one by one they were taken from a platform over a small yard filled with swing gates. I'm not going to go into what they actually did to the cattle because it's really horrible, and I did give a warning at the start that this is about a meat processing plant, so if you're vegan or vegetarian, it may be a little distressing. I can't even go into it, so I'm going to just go to the next portion. But let me just say, I have read this, and it was brutal what they did to these poor animals. But again, that was what they were trained to do back then, and I don't think they realised the distress that it caused the animals. They just weren't up on things like that back in the old days. But I don't feel the need to share that with everybody. I was nearly going to read it all out, but I thought, this is yuck, so I'm not going to. So I'm just going to skip to the next portion. So basically the carcasses were taken away and transformed into beef extract, or what was technically known back then as extractum carnis libig. The process by which the meat is preserved is very simple and is patented. It was patented some years ago by a Mr. McCall, who I believe acts as the London agent of the company. The meat was put raw into tins with a very small quantity of water. The tin is closed up and securely soldered, only a small pinhole before being referred to left in the centre of the lid. When full, the tins are placed in a bath which holds 100 at a time and contains a chemical liquid, the components of which are unknown. This bath is then heated by means of a steam coil to a certain temperature, which is very carefully regulated. The water in the tin soon begins to generate steam, and the steam by its expansion gradually expels every particle of atmospheric air, which escapes through the small hole that they left in the lid. The tins are boiled in this way for about 4 hours, and when the meat is cooked, the meat preserver drops a little solder upon the hole in each lid and thus hermetically seals the tin. The meat thus sealed is boiled for about 15 minutes longer, and then the tins are taken out of the bath, plunged into cold water. The steam inside the vessels thus is condensed and partial vacuum is created. This finishes the process. The tins are put away to cool. They are next painted red, properly labelled, packed in their cases and sent away for sale. So this was all like steampunky stuff back then, but how ingenious that they figured out to leave a hole for the steam to escape in the tin, or otherwise the tins probably would have just exploded under all that pressure, and then cooling them down pressurized the tins further to keep the preserved meat fresh. So that's kind of impressive that they managed to figure all this out. And that would have been like the latest technology back then, but today it's so primitive. But they did really well, and that company did really well for a number of years. So the boiling is an operation that required great care and experience. Unless the atmosphere was right, the meat would spoil. So it's impossible to avoid some waste, and about 1% of the tins do have to be thrown away at times. There is near the works a small mountain of these rejected vessels, which have accumulated during many months. And actually, I would love to go back up to Ramornie with a metal detector, because you have to think, like, maybe there's still a few tins or something left in the ground up there, and it'd be really cool to just see if we could find anything else and just take pictures and film. I do really want to go back up there, because despite this being a slaughterhouse, that was not a pleasant place for the animals. What it has become now seems to be quite spiritual and lovely, and I really did enjoy our few hours that we spent there the other day. We did get a little paranormal activity, nothing bad. It was interesting, but you'll see on the other video anyway. So he goes on to say the faulty tins are easily detected, the air finds a way into them, and it bulges out the ends, which become concave instead of convex. And when shaken, the meat sounds quite different to when it's done properly and efficiently preserved. So the meat extract is made in another part of the establishment and is somewhat more tedious, though not such a delicate process. Okay, so what they used to do with a lot of the refuse from the animals, such as bones and hide and other things they didn't use for the preserved meat in the cans, is they would put it all into a vat with water and simmer it for some hours. And it would they would make it into a very strong beef tea. I'm not going to go into that process either because it's yucky, and I honestly don't think the viewers would enjoy hearing about it. So we're just going to say this was another way that they utilised the entire animal. So the refuse meat is removed from this tea, and so thoroughly is the nutrient taken from it that the refuse is not even fit for manure. So when dry, it resembles wood or sapless fibrous bark. The liquor is put into a vat and gradually evaporated until it assumes the consistency of treacle. And this operation lasts for 2 or 3 days, and the heat has to be extremely carefully regulated in order that the essence may not be scorched. So having been sufficiently evaporated and kept constantly stirred by means of machinery fitted for the purpose, the essence is put into small tins, which are then also soldered up and are then ready for sale. The extract contains as much nutrient as about 30 times its bulk of meat, and it will keep for years, whether exposed to the air or enclosed in tins. A single teaspoonful put into a pint of water will make a basin for a strong broth, and it only requires such additional flavouring as may suit the palate of the consumer. So they were using this, and I would say back then, like, you have to think, we didn't have like ready-made bone broth and things like that they have in the shops, and you know, we're sort of coming up to World War One, towards the end of the life of this factory. So I would say things like the meat in the cans, and this beef tea that they made this extract out of would have been quite a useful thing to the people back then. It would have been very vitamin rich, and they would have used it in their gravies, their soups, their stews. They would have used it for a lot of things. And I would really be interested to know if anybody from our area, from the Grafton area, or maybe even from somewhere else, if any of your grandparents used to use the products from Ramornie. Did any of them use the canned meat? Did any of them use the beef extract for things? If you can remember them talking about it. I'm not sure if my grandmother did, I can't remember, but that still would have been many, many years after the factory closed, but her grandparents may have. So if anybody's ever used it, or you have an old tin from there, I'd really love to know. So please let me know in the comment section below. I'd love to find out if anybody ever actually used this stuff or remembers their grandparents talking about it. Then they would take the offal from the animals, and it was boiled under pressure of about 80 pounds of steam, and this extracts all the fat, and it is packed into barrels in the usual way, and it was shipped back to England as tallow. And they also used the tongues and the palates. They were also preserved and are rendered. And now this is this reporter's word, you have to remember. He wrote this in like 1900, something like that. But what he would go on to say is, he said they are rendered by most delicious. They were preserved and are rendered most delicious by the treatment they receive. They are put into tins with some seasoning or gravy and are boiled in the same way as the preserved meat. The palates are esteemed and a great delicacy. And you have to think now as well, like for the meat eaters, a lot of people really enjoy beef cheeks. So it's probably along those lines. And I think there are people that do still eat tongue and that kind of thing, but yeah, definitely not for me. And they would also cure the hides, and they were disposed of in the usual way. So what he means by that, I'm not sure, but I'd say he would mean that they were sold maybe for clothing or for leather work or for floor mats, something like that. I'm not sure. It doesn't go into that in great detail, but they did use those as well. Since its establishment in September 1866, this company has done a considerable trade. They're getting into the old language again, so he says, from some statistics which were furnished me last year by Mr. Baldock, I'd say that would be from some statistics that were given to him last year. Okay. So the statistic that Mr. Baldock, the overseer in charge of the works, provided the reporter, he finds that between September 1866 and November 1868, there were killed at Ramornie 7,481 head of cattle, the weight of the meat thus obtained being, over 4 million pounds. This furnished over 287,000 tins of preserved meat, which were disposed of in English, French, and colonial markets. The tallow got from the above cut cattle amounted to over 6,000 CWT. I'm not really sure what CWT is. It must be an old scale thing. You have to remember that was all different back then too. And there were, besides the hides, tongues, and pallets, equal in number to the cattle slaughtered, sent away to England and elsewhere. From these figures, it will be seen that the establishment had done a great deal of work. The company held contracts with the French government for the supply of considerable quantities of meat, and I believe could find a market for more than it could preserve. The chief difficulty in the way of the undertaking was the difficulty of obtaining the cattle at a fair price. Whether the difficulty has ceased to exist, the reporter didn't know at the time. But the company has turned out many thousands of pounds of meat since I visited the works, and has, I hope, firmly established itself among the profitable industries of the colony. Charles Tyndall also bought and lived upon a beautiful homestead at Ramornie in 1888, also named Ramornie Homestead, where he lived with his family until he returned to England before his death in 1910. And I'm extremely happy to say that the Ramornie Homestead still stands to this day. So the reporter's article actually ended about the profitable industries to the colony. I probably should have mentioned that. And I just looked up a little bit more about Ramornie Station, Ramornie Homestead, and Charles Tyndall. And it's kind of launched into that before I realised where I was. So he bought and lived at Ramornie Homestead in 1888, also named the house Ramornie Homestead, where he lived with his family until he returned to England before his death in 1914. And I'm really happy to say that Ramornie Homestead still stands to this day and is owned privately. I don't think we'll ever get the chance to go and look at the place or to put it on film because it is a private residence. But if I ever get the chance, I might even just try to drive past just so I can see the homestead because it is beautiful. Here's some photos of the old homestead and how it looks now. And they are from a real estate website that they had the photos of the house and the property, how it still stands today. So it's really lovely to know that there is still a family living there at the homestead, especially, with the fact that the meatworks are gone. There's just ruins there now, but the house is still being loved and enjoyed by a local family, and I think that's just so lovely. Honestly, we had some of the most amazing Victorian architecture in Grafton for many years. I didn't actually get to see because it was gone before I was even born, but there was some absolutely beautiful sandstone buildings that were in Grafton that aren't there anymore, and I think that's really sad because that architecture was absolutely stunning. So to know that Ramornie Homestead is still standing, it's still pretty much... There have been some improvements, as always you need to do with an older property, but it still pretty much looks like it did when the Tyndall family lived there, and I think that's just so cool. So that's basically the history of the Ramornie Meatworks and what went on there. If you would like to know the ins and outs of the production of the meat, I will provide a link to the actual story in the description box below, but I just didn't feel the need to go into what was done to the poor cattle to get the meat. I didn't want to say that here on YouTube because it's distressing, and it's distressing for me, and I didn't want to talk about it. So sorry if you did want to hear, but I will link you the article so you can go read it for yourself, and I don't have to gross everybody out by telling them. I'm sure our imaginations are doing enough. So yeah. So I hope you guys have found this interesting. I certainly did. And I would like to thank Trove for their incredible website where you can go and you can join up to Trove. You can sign up. And it gives you access to a lot of old newspapers and photos to do with the colonial times in Australia. I've had a good look at it over the weekend and I absolutely love Trove. I have used them before. Just when I wanted to find the pictures of the old buildings and things that used to be around Grafton, because the area is so old and it is so rich in history. So thank you so much to Trove for providing this service that we can go and we can look up these old articles and find them. And thanks to Kev and Jess and Chantal for finding all the articles and the old photos. They're just amazing. And also thanks to the Clarence River Historical Society, which also provided a little bit of information. And that's where we found a lot of the information for our investigation in today's video. And the biggest thank you ever to my amazing team at Clarence Valley Paranormal, who without I would not be able to make these trips and videos. They just wouldn't happen. These guys go above and beyond for me. They are always full of enthusiasm. They're always happy for an adventure, and I appreciate that so, so much. So thank you to my team. You guys absolutely rock, and I just could not do it without you. You guys are the best. And that's about it. So now you have the history. Stay tuned for the field trip investigation video. The location is stunning, and the video and the trip was a lot of fun for us. So as always, guys, thank you so, so much for watching, and I'll see you all again soon in our next video. So stay safe, much love, and bye for now.